You gonna give this to him or something?
Evidently. You can leave that here if you'd like. We'll come back and get it. Or unless you've got... Okay. Great.
This is, in case they let you use the projector, we may need this. Mark, have they given you any idea how much time we might have?
They didn't give me any idea. I'm hoping to get, you know, half hour, 40 minutes, kind of. Yeah.
The problem is that we have a series of lies in this country that go deeper than we can possibly imagine. And what we have with 9/11 is the opportunity for every American to step up to the plate, get informed, and get really pissed off.
How are you doing there?
Hi, I'm Richard Gage.
How are you? How are you doing there?
Good to meet you.
We're morning paper on Sunday. Closed down. Well, out here, this is the backdrop for all of our presidential primary interviews.
Oh.
Turn the table around, candidate sits there, we shoot that.
So I founded this organization about 18 months ago, and since then we do have 260 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. So I'm grateful you came in to meet with me, because you're gonna see why. What I've done is prepared a little 20-minute presentation for you. The DVD is 2 hours, and I'm going to give a 2-hour presentation tonight.
Right.
Where are we going? Keene
State College.
Keene State, yeah. So what we're looking at is evidence for the controlled demolition of all 3 high-rise buildings in the World Trade Center. Most of us are familiar with the 2 Twin Towers, but there's also Building 7. Have you looked at that at all?
Well, I tell you, Building 7 is, some of the folks here may be aware of, you know, my limited research into the area. Building 7 is the one that catches my interest.
Yeah, me too. Who was in this building? We have the CIA, the IRS, the Department of Defense, Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, the SEC. So the key question, of course, is could Al-Qaeda have gotten access to this building, which is one of the most secure buildings outside the Pentagon? Probably. Answer is really probably no. So who could have set those explosives? So we're probably looking at some sort of inside job. And that's where we, as architects and engineers, draw the line. We don't speculate as to who, why, how. We just show the specific evidence, which is incontrovertible, for the explosive controlled demolition of this building. And unfortunately, the evidence is even greater at the Twin Towers. Building 7 still standing. It didn't fall until the late afternoon. And here's some of the fires on the floors, curiously enough, occupied by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases it was actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom.
It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the 3rd time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before. A building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Now, Dan never repeated those words after that day, but people tend to call it like they see it on the first day, these local and national reporters.
What you're seeing,
what we see is a rapid onset of destruction, therefore, at the base, but starting at the core down here, which drops the penthouse. So we're taking out the core columns first, which tends to bring the inside in, or at least keeps it from falling out. And there's a classic kink in the middle, which you'll see in this video, where we have a side-by-side comparison between World Trade Center 7 and a known controlled demolition. So it falls, into a tidy rubble pile with minimal damage to the post office and some damage to the Verizon building. It's not a perfect implosion. But demolition waves, removing column support, how does that happen? Well, there's 80 80 or so columns in this building, you have to take out the core columns all within 1/10 of a second of each other. And then 1/2 a second later, all the perimeter columns, or you don't get this perfectly smooth, symmetrical drop into its own footprint. It would start to tilt over. The explosions start down here, and then they're synchronistically timed floor by floor. This is an exact science, and there's a lot that can go wrong.
He came back over with his hand over the radio, and what sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, "Just run for your life, just run for your life." And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
So he's not just talking about explosions, though, but he heard a Red Cross worker carrying a radio with a countdown. So now we know fires don't respond to countdowns, or at least collapses as a result of fires don't respond to countdowns. He's been on several radio programs sharing the same story. This is Kevin McPadden, P-A-D-D-E-N, former Air Force Special Operations for Search and Rescue. Flame and debris coming down. The building is about to blow up. He knows the building's going to blow up. He knows they're going to bring it down by explosive demolition. He's telling the bystanders. And so it completely violates the official story. And the first guy coming away from the building carrying all the stuff on his back, keep your eye on that building, it's about to come down.
Hard evidence there. I mean, it's not just a person walking in a crowd. It's a person who's, as you say, has the foreknowledge. So I'd just be intrigued by them. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is your job. Yeah, this is what we need you to be doing. Fire Commissioner Thomas von Essen records 1,000 firefighters and EMTs, and 118 of them are talking about sounds and flashes of explosions. And we didn't know about this until August of 2005, when the New York Times sued the city of New York to obtain them, and they finally won. Now, none of these explosions and none of these flashes are a part of the official story. That's when I saw the building coming down. Pop, pop, pop. And so here's the North Tower. Let's take a look. What you're going to want to watch for here is that this is where the jet plane impacted this level. I think it was on the other side of the building, although I can't quite tell. You're going to see this start to shorten like that. In other words, the explosions are taking out the structure here, and we lose half this mass before it ever begins to go down. Let's take a look. There's a series of explosions that occur up here. Here's one. There's another one over here, right there. And then the building comes telescoping, and then it starts to go down. So we've lost half of that mass in the first 2 seconds that was supposed to be driving that building down. And we have a new fresh fuel source in all these flames. And this incredible explosive event, things blowing out. Is it going back? So when it goes back, you can see... oh, now we're going to slow down. This video just got made for me. All the way around like a belt. All 4 sides. Now, none of these explosions are a part of the official story. None of them. Oops.
We came down to the lobby. It was like the explosion. There was nobody in. What do we do? We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least 2 blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
Planned to take down a building.
All the way down. I was watching it and running. Just ran up West. And then you just sort of this cloud of shit chasing you down. Couldn't outrun it. West Street. I couldn't outrun it. So what'd you do? I jumped behind a battalion car. I hit under the car. I was waiting to die.
So let's take a look at this molten metal and see why it might be important. Structural engineer Leslie Robertson, as of 21 days after the attack, fires were still burning and molten steel was still running. Is he a credible witness? Is this guy a credible witness? Bronx firefighter, seeing a crane lifting a steel beam vertically from deep within the catacombs of Ground Zero, dripping with molten steel. The fires weren't extinguished until December 19th, 3 months, even though they were making basically a lake out there. This guy, Mark Loiseau, headed up the demolition effort. He talks about molten metal observed in the basement areas in the Twin Towers and in World Trade Center 7. Now, NASA's Avarice equipment was on USGS overflights, and they spotted with infrared these hot spots. This is Building 7, this is Building 1, and this is Building 2. These surface temperatures are 1,340 degrees. Those were much hotter than the actual fires in any of these buildings, and that's on the surface. What is actually being seen here is the much, much hotter temperatures down in the basements, which is consistent with what you're about to see relative to eyewitnesses and molten metal. In fact, the backhoe picks it up. Now, when we
get down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry, like lava from a volcano.
Like lava flowing from a volcano. And yet NIST flatly denies the existence of molten metal. I know of nobody, absolutely nobody that's seen it. This lead engineer, John Gross, there's no eyewitnesses, nobody's produced it, and yet I just have shown you not countless, half a dozen, but here's another half a dozen. Peter Tully, molten steel. Astani, structural engineer. I saw melted girders at the World Trade Center. I talked to contractors who saw molten steel. So these are all relevant because they directly contradict the story, but what could produce this molten metal? Let's take a look.
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel.
Could have been used. And in producing melting like FEMA documented in the ends of these beams. The sol gels, if they were used, would leave a telltale residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane, which is an unusual chemical. And Eric Schwartz's EPA analysis, he says one chemical dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done.
Well, I've been following some of this. Certainly the Building 7 is the one that interests me up until this point. And he raises some points here that caused me to want to do some more reading.
Good, thank you.
Best luck.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, good.
Great to meet you. Good luck with your research. We just met with Jim, the president and editor of the Keene Sentinel, and I was delighted. He seemed open, responsive, inquisitive, disturbed, very present. The question is, what will Jim do with this information? And that is the key question. He looked inquisitive, he took notes, he indicated he was going to do more research, but he's going to come up against a ceiling, and that ceiling is the forces that be that do not want the public to understand the truth about 9/11. And what will he do personally? And each one of us has to ask ourselves this question when we come up against that ceiling. There will be pressure. He will be told that this is not something that we want to deal with. Now, he's the president of this company. He can do what he wants. But there's pressures that he has to respond to as well in the mainstream media and associations to which he belongs. And we're all crossing our fingers and holding him in our hearts so that he can make a difference in Keene
and not succumb to the pressure as so many have. So we will be with you, Jim.
Sorry to interrupt. Did you organize this event?
Well,
or
I
help with it?
participated in organizing the march.
There were many of us. Many of us.
We work at our house each Monday night, and it's a consensus agreement as to how we'll proceed, and that's what we wind up with tonight. It's one of our results.
We are fortunate to have someone here tonight who will open that door and offer scientific, forensic evidence of the most emotional part of that day, the collapse of the Twin Towers, and shed light on the mysterious circumstances surrounding Building 7. Richard Gage is a member of the American Institute of Architects and has been a practicing architect for 20 years, working on most types of building construction, including numerous fireproof, steel-framed buildings. In 2006, he decided to bring his architectural training and experience to bear on what he believes is a key question for all building professionals to consider. How did World Trade Center Building Number 7 and the Twin Towers fall symmetrically and completely, collapsing at near free-fall speed? Please join me in welcoming to New Hampshire and Keene State College our speaker, Mr. Richard Gage.
Thank you very much. Last time I came here, it was December 13th, and actually I couldn't get here. You had your nor'eastern, and I got to experience that. It was the awesome experience and the only experience of New Hampshire that I had ever had until now. So let's bust down the door tonight and make it a real worthy and incredible experience for all of us. No matter where we think we stand on this issue, we're likely to be surprised tonight by the information. I am just delighted to be here. And I want to thank you also for being willing tonight to take on the extremely difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center and its staggering loss of life on 9/11. It's extremely important that we understand the whole truth about this event, because it served as the pretext for the invasion of two countries in which already 1 million people have perished. Also as a pretext for many of the loss, for the pretext of the loss of many of our cherished civil liberties here at home. The Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the forthcoming H.R. 1955, which I hope all of you will be very disturbed about by the end of the evening. Now, another 9/11 is promised by members of the Bush administration, by members of the media, and by members of the Congress. Now, this is outrageous, and we can stop it if we start to really understand how this happened and dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what happened and why, and to bring those actually responsible to justice. These are the reasons that we have to peer into this painful part of our recent history and to re-examine the relatively new physical evidence from 9/11 which we have not seen in the mainstream media, and to find out why, for instance, a 2006 poll by the New York Times and CBS reveals that 28% of Americans believe that the Bush administration is lying, and not just about the events in Iraq, but about the events of 9/11. Of even greater concern, another poll that year by Scripps Howard Ohio University, which found that a shocking 16% of Americans believe that the World Trade Center Twin Towers were brought down by explosives. Now, let's just find out where we are in the room tonight. How many of you pretty much agree with the official story that we have the jet planes hitting the Twin Towers, massive explosions of jet fuel, structural weakening by fire, and then a gravitational collapse? We want to find out which camp everybody falls into so that we can see if we're making any progress. Really high. I'm actually going to do a count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, Over here, 11, 12. Okay, how many of you pretty much aren't sure you're here to learn about it? You can only raise your hand once. Okay, a lot of you. This is great. Somebody write that number down, 12, for the first count, George. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52. All right. How many of you trust that count? And how many of you pretty much believe that these buildings were brought down by explosive controlled demolition? Okay, the remainder. I won't count all of you, but I'll ask for a count, George, from the total at the end. Thank you so much. Now, I will present to you tonight the very clear evidence that all three World Trade Center buildings, the iconic Twin Towers, and the Building 7, this mysterious collapse that Jack referenced, were destroyed not by fire, as was told to us by the government and the media, but by controlled demolition with explosives. Let's first find out a little bit about me. I'm currently working on, well, this is what I've worked on recently, the construction administration and construction documents for a $120 million high school campus in the San Francisco Bay Area. Currently working on a $400 million mixed-use project in Nevada with over 1,200 tons of steel framing, including a mid-rise fireproofed office building. So I'm very busy. I have at least 2 full-time jobs. We are going to go really fast through this information tonight. It's not because I want to go fast. It's because I don't want to keep you here till midnight. And there's a lot of information, so you're going to want to avail yourself of the website, which is listed on your handout, ae911truth.org. There's lots of evidence for both the Twin Towers and World Trade Center 7 on the right, and you can look at all our petition signers. We now have over 264 architects and engineers demanding a real investigation. This is very important. These are not conspiracy theorists, but architects and engineers. There's, as I'll show you, scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice as well. You can step through on the upper left the PowerPoint presentation at your own pace and read some of this text, which we're going to have to fly through tonight. You can also watch the DVD online, or you can purchase it in the back. So, let's proceed. Why have all of these architects and engineers, why are they demanding a new investigation? And these engineers. Why does Time magazine show that 36% of the American people believe the administration is somehow complicit, the Bush administration? A new Zogby poll finding 51% of Americans in 2007 want to probe the president and the vice president still after 6 years regarding these attacks. Why do 200 survivors and family members want a new investigation? 110 military, intelligence, law enforcement, and government officials, 170 distinguished professors, and 110 entertainment and media professionals, as well as students and student groups, one of whom you'll meet tonight, student scholars for 9/11 Truth. You can learn about how many students all across the nation are demanding a real investigation. Well, on 9/11, we were subjected to these shocking attacks that killed thousands of our own citizens, and not since Pearl Harbor has this happened. And we were put into basically a state of shock. The 6 years since has given us some objectivity, as well as a lot of new evidence, which I will be presenting to you tonight, that we did not have in the early years following 9/11. We need to step out then from this shock-induced trance, reevaluate this evidence, and re-examine objectively these 3 high-rise collapses. But first, let's get on the same page and find out how the story developed right from the street itself.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 planes had flown
Lights.
the steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them.
Let's turn out the lights on the stage.
Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the building to give way.
Mark, we need the lights off on the stage.
A myth developed, said by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience.
Greg, lights.
Elements of the myth. The impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the building failing and suddenly imploded. In mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right to the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second. Mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
Who is that guy? And why does he have all the answers that engineers were working hard for years to figure out right on the street, giving the first story to all the major networks so that it would be picked up and be the same? And who talks like that? We were in a state of shock that morning, and he's saying, I witnessed. That's a pretty objective comment. So we have to look at some of these things very, very carefully.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was a combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire that caused collapse.
Well, let's take a look at that and see if it holds water. There are a number of ways in which buildings are destroyed, and they have each of them very different and identifiable characteristics. So let's take a basic lesson. Fires, they burn for about 20 minutes in a certain area, and they move on to other areas. Any fire protection engineer or fireman will tell you that even very large, very hot, and very long-lasting fires, which we did not have in the Twin Towers, have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building. But fires, when they do bring down buildings, such as in a wood frame building, it's an organic process. It follows the path of least resistance and obeys it falls over, it topples. So it doesn't go straight down through the structure. Compare that to controlled demolition, which we'll be taking a very close look at, where it comes straight down through the structure. Buildings and earthquakes fall over. They don't go straight down through themselves. In the very, very few examples where we have had earthquakes collapse like that, you tend to see a lot of floors at the bottom. We'll be looking for those floors in the Twin Towers. Explosions produce pyroclastic dust and volumes, which we'll be talking about, of this pulverized concrete. But first, these buildings fell over and collapsed. The structure tends to hang together. The structural system is not dissected into its individual components, and the concrete is not pulverized and sent everywhere. These explosions, you tend to hear the explosion, you see flashes of light, and that's what we'll be looking for in all three of these collapses on 9/11. We have this pyroclastic dust, pyro heat, which includes this rapid expansion due to the heat of these clouds in this cauliflower-like formation. So let's take a look at Building 7, a football field length away from the Twin Towers, and see if it doesn't have any of the characteristics of these controlled demolitions here. Well, we have hundreds of examples of controlled demolition from all across the country from which to make our comparison, because it's the most commonly used method to demolish high-rise buildings. And I'll show you in a second what the high-rise looks like when it's being demolished with explosives. They can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of the controlled demolition is to remove a structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so economically. Typically, a tall building is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges adjacent to the columns and beams throughout the building and then detonating them in a very precise order. And synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight to pull the exterior inward, and destroying the building from the ground up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do much of the destruction. The result is an implosion, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at free fall speed into a tiny rubble pile that's consolidated, and the steel skeleton is broken up and ready for shipment. This is a feat now that only a handful of companies in the U.S. can even accomplish. Let's take a look. Rapid onset at the base, sound sites of explosions, pyroclastic dust, free fall, speed into its own footprint, a fairly symmetrical speed, symmetrical outcome, and it is broken up and ready for shipment. So these are the typical features which we'll be comparing Building 7 to. Sudden onset, straight down symmetrical collapse, demolition waves removing column support, free fall speed through the path of greatest resistance, total dismemberment of steel structure for shipping, minimal damage to adjacent structures, sounds and flashes of explosions, enormous volumes and clouds of pulverized concrete and pyroclastic dust. Squibs, or explosive charges. Let's put a little bit of light on the house and no light on the stage. Squibs we have, which are mistimed explosions. They tend to go off at the wrong time. And we have chemical evidence of cutter charges in typical controlled demolitions. Now, we have no characteristics of destruction by fire. What does that mean? Fire does not produce any one of these typical characteristics of controlled demolition, let alone all 10. The odds are enormous, as we'll see. We have government documentation because you need approval in advance of course, any controlled demolition. And we have expert corroboration. They agree that it's a controlled demolition. And we have foreknowledge because these are planned months in advance. It takes that much time to engineer and plant these explosives. So all of this goes to prove a controlled demolition. Well, let's take a look at Building 7. Now, and see if these features, as we build this body of evidence together, if it comes out to work. Now, for the proof, World Trade Center 7 was easily the highest building in 33 of our states, a 47-story skyscraper. How many of you have never heard of this building? Okay, a good number of you. This is really important that you're here because this building came down at 5:20 in the afternoon of 9/11 after both towers had collapsed. So we're starting out with Building 7, 47 stories, a football field length away from the North Tower, and not hit by an airplane. It doesn't have the convenient excuse that the Twin Towers had. The official story gave the Twin Towers, that is to say, the airplanes knocked off the fireproofing. Okay, let's take a look. This is the building right here, close up and personal. And what we see is that the North Tower collapsed and kind of pelted Building 7 with some debris, started some random fires. NIST tells us there's fires on 8 floors. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. I'll tell you more about them. They're one of the investigative agencies. So we have a couple other fires on various floors and various facades of the building. Here you can see World Trade Center 7 in the distance beyond the already collapsed World Trade Center 1, which is the North Tower. So we have fires on the 7th, 12th, and 13th floors. Curiously enough, the 12th and 13th floor are occupied by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which loses thousands of files related to hundreds of cases that it was actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. So we want some investigative probing in that direction as well. Now there's a lot of smoke on this side of the building, and some say this is smoke from the adjacent fires. World Trade Center 6 caught in a negative updraft. NIST tells us there's only 8 floors on fire. So if this smoke is coming out of this building, clearly there would have had to have been an amazing fire on almost every floor, busting those windows so the smoke could get out. So we don't, some of us don't believe that all this smoke is from this building. So let's take a look first then, as we build this body of evidence. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base? Let's listen to Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we're going to videotape the collapse of this building. Amazing, incredible picture work. For the third time today, reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen in much of television before. A building was deliberately destroyed by low-place dynamite to knock it down.
Now, Dan has not repeated those words after that first day, and a lot of these reporters that you'll see in the video today have not repeated their work either. There is a clamping down process that occurs, and it's really important to understand this. So we have this sudden onset of destruction at the base. Let's see if we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the footprint. Smooth, symmetrical. Watch the parapet of the building, and in this shot you can see the classic kink in the middle. Of course, the penthouse goes down first, and then this kink right here. Right there. That's because they want to bring the outside of the building in on itself to avoid damage to adjacent structures. Now, let's take a look at this side-by-side comparison. Here's a known controlled demolition in this Italian debate film. And on the left side we have World Trade Center 7.
In ogni caso non vi sono prove di demolizione controllata. I filmati portati a sostegno di questa tesi sono unicamente.
Anybody see any similarities? Now, some think these are squibs in the upper left corner of Building 7. Some aren't sure. So that's a point of investigation. It needs to be understood. Now, this is the rubble pile. The building drops into its own footprint, avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and a little bit of slop around the edges. I could have done a better job with this one myself. No. This is a feat that only a half a dozen companies in the United States can even attempt. So it's actually very, very difficult work. Do we have demolition waves removing the column supports? Well, this building has over 80 columns. And in order to bring down a building symmetrically at free fall into its own footprint, what we have to do is take out all 24 core columns within 1/10 of a second of each other. Followed a half a second later, the perimeter columns within 1/10 of a second of each other. The key question for everybody to ask themselves is, can fire accomplish that? Okay? That's very, very important. I'll let you come to your own conclusion. But when you do that, what you get is this free fall speed through the path of greatest resistance, item number 4. And here you can see the downward gaining momentum in this second-by-second clip, showing the effect of gravity and acceleration increasing. In other words, no resistance at all from those columns. They all had to have been removed. You plot this on a graph of drop distance versus time, and it fits the data perfectly. Number 5, do we have total dismemberment of the steel structure? Well, this 47-story skyscraper collapses to 4 stories. Now, if the frame were not cut at all the column and beam connections, you could not have that degree of compression. Therefore, they were all cut, and all this steel was removed by FEMA at 800 truckloads a day, leaving no steel left for investigators to examine. This is destruction of evidence, and it's criminal. We want an investigation there as well. Do we have minimal damage to adjacent structures? Yes, but let's listen to the EMT worker on 9/11.
We were walking the building after the moving through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then, about a second later, the cops pulled the Gage out, and the building followed after that, and the building crashed down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then one of our cops.
Now, wait a minute. A shockwave, a sound of a clap of thunder, the windows busting out, and then the building coming down. That doesn't sound like a gravitational collapse, where the building's coming down and pushing things out of the way. Let's listen to Craig Bartner, whistleblower from New York Police Department.
And the whole time you're hearing boom, 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 boom. So, I think I know what explosion when I hear it. I was real close to building 7 when it fell down. And running away from that sucked. That's one of the things I live with all the time. And I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony now. I hear explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did. And a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
It gets better. Let's listen to Kevin McPadden, former Air Force Special Operations Search and Rescue.
He came back over with his hand over the radio, and what sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, "Just run for your life, just run for your life." And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom, and it's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compressor, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. To me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Kevin McPadden is speaking all around the country too. Do we have enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete? Now, a countdown. Now, the fires don't collapse buildings to countdowns. They don't collapse steel frame buildings at all, but that aside, we're talking about a Red Cross worker that he was next to, behind a line established to keep people far back from Building 7 because they were expecting this collapse. Look at this pyroclastic dust racing down from Building 7, the street at 35 miles an hour. These are gases that are expanding as a result of the incredible heat, which far surpasses the heat available in the few small fires that were in the building. This gas cloud expansion can be calculated and is in the work of Jim Hoffman, and we'll get to that when we get to the Twin Towers. Do we have pools of molten iron? Yes, and we will look at them very carefully. And this is extremely important in both Building 7 and the Twin Towers, and we have chemical evidence of cutter charges as well. But for right now, molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later, when the rubble was still being removed. Molten steel found also at World Trade Center 7. Now, this is the owner of Controlled Demolition who had the key contract to clean up the site. So we have chemical evidence of cutter charges, which we will get to because it is the same evidence in the case of the Twin Towers. So all of this evidence boils together to show direct evidence of explosives, which is supported now by this auxiliary evidence, one of which is the fact that fires can't produce any one of these key characteristics, let alone all 10 of them. Now, what about fires? Why do high-rise steel frame buildings not fall down? Well, one of the reasons in fire is due to the fireproofing surrounding them. This is a 3-hour fireproofing protection on the columns, 2 hours on the beams, and this is one of the reasons that they don't come down. Yet, The fireproofing is only designed to last a couple, 3 hours to get the occupants out of the building. What about these buildings? In New York, 50-story building burned 6 hours over 5 floors. In Los Angeles in '88, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. Philadelphia, a 38-story building burns 18 hours over 8 floors. Now, none of these buildings have collapsed. Neither has Venezuela, Caracas, which burned 17 hours over 26 floors here. Now, contrast that to these few small fires that burned during the afternoon and brought this building down in 6.5 seconds. Well, let's look at the supporting information from FEMA. There were several investigations into these buildings, but let's not call them investigations. They were performance reports at best by their own acknowledgement. These were volunteers that came together from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Now, these are not your average PTA volunteers. These guys have $10 million annual blast contracts with the Department of Defense. They have a stake in following the official story. So what we're asking for, the 264 architects and engineers, is a real investigation, an unbiased investigation, an unimpeachable investigation with under oath with subpoena power. We did not get those things. The FEMA report came afterwards, and I'll show you what they came up with. But they had some funding finally, $600,000. Compare that to Monica Lewinsky's affair with Bill, which took $40 million of your money to investigate. And here we have the third worst structural failure in modern history, getting $600,000. Followed by the Weidlinger-Silverstein report, so Larry Silverstein could collect on his insurance. They had to overturn the collapse theory of FEMA, and that's when that evolved into the NIST report, where they did finally get some real funding, $20 million, and we'll look at what they did with that funding. So FEMA, interestingly enough, suggests that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 had a small debris field as the facade was pulled downward, suggesting an internal failure and implosion. Sounds like a controlled demolition to me. So what do they say, though? The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. The best hypothesis, which is fire and then random damage from the World Trade Center 1, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait, their best hypothesis has only a low probability of occurrence. Maybe they should come up with another hypothesis. Did you investigate the evidence for controlled demolition? No. Why not? Because, what was the reason? Because it wasn't because it couldn't have been a controlled demolition is basically the reason. It's circular reasoning. It's ludicrous. Did you find any evidence for controlled demolition? No, we didn't. Later on in the report, did you look for any evidence? No, we didn't look. That's what I was trying to tell you. And so they say further investigation and analysis are needed to resolve the issue. But unfortunately, they had this critical evidence destroyed, taken away, and by 800 truckloads a day, as I mentioned. Surely the 9/11 Commission, who was tasked with explaining all of the 9/11 events, would give us a reason for the collapse of the third worst structural failure in modern history. No, not one page in the 571 pages, not one sentence mentions Building 7. It is the biggest secret of 9/11, as evidenced by all of the hands in the room who were unaware. Without explanation, they completely ignore it, and we have Max Cleland saying it's a national scandal. This investigation is compromised. That's a heck of a statement from a 9/11 commissioner, resigning, realizing the setup. NIST, what have they done? Now they have this investigation in their laps right now, 6 years later, still no official word on 9/11, on Building 7's mysterious collapse. What do they say? Well, but truthfully, Shyam Sunder, the chief engineer for the analysis, says, I don't really know we've had this trouble getting a handle on Building 7. Well, they've shopped it out now to Applied Research Associates in Albuquerque. Now, this is another very intense defense contractor. This is not an objective building analysis. In fact, curiously enough, they do some very mysterious work in different kinds of weapons that are futuristic. But they're told not to examine the 1st through the 7th floor or the 47th floor. Wow! Why would you handcuff the investigation from the get-go? That's where all the initial explosions were, in the 1st through the 7th floor. By the way, how could you put explosives in Building 7 without the occupants knowing it? Well, maybe all you have to do is put the explosives in the mechanical portions of the buildings, which did occupy the 1st through the 7th floor substantially. Without the occupants on the upper floors knowing. But that's where the evidence of controlled demolition is. Let's take a look at this testimony from some of these first responders and whistleblowers. We have Craig Bartner, whom you heard from. I think I know an explosion when I hear it. Thoom, thoom. Kevin McPadden, who talks about a countdown and sounds of explosions. And we'll hear from a lot more first responders when we get to the Twin Towers. Do we have expert corroboration? Well, Danny Jawenko, a top European controlled demolitions expert. He says it starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work without a doubt. Very, very interesting. Professor Emeritus of Structural Analysis. He's Hugo Bachmann. He says, in my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished. This is the chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering. We have 6 structural engineers among the 264 architects and engineers. One of them, and myself and one of our fire protection engineers, was interviewed last weekend by the BBC, and they are doing a 1-hour documentary on the collapse of World Trade Center 7. They interviewed us for 4 or 5 hours. So we'll be featured. We're very excited to see what they come up with. Given the last piece they came up with on the 9/11 Truth Movement, we're not holding our breath about presenting the information as fairly as I'm presenting it to you today. But we'll see. Who knows? Is there foreknowledge of this collapse? Well, Chief Nick Viscani of Division 14, a 34-year veteran, we're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down. But wait a minute. No steel frame high-rise building has ever come down due to fire. Firemen go up them all the time, and they're announcing the collapse of a building with only a few small fires. They had pulled out the firemen in the early afternoon or late morning, and they're looking at themselves, why aren't we putting out this building? None of them knew. They say, it's going to collapse. You know, it has structural damage, they're telling them. Well, here's Indira Singh saying by noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from the triage site up to Pace University a little further away because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down. Is that the word they use? Yeah, they say we're going to have to bring it down. Very interesting. Now they're talking about some kind of volition. It's not just going to come down, we're going to bring it down. It gets better. Listen to these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7 and the policeman caught on tape by CNN. The building is about to blow up. Wait, again, never before in history has a steel frame high-rise building blown up due to fire. So they're announcing it's going to blow up, and he says, keep your eye on that building. It's about to come down. Does this relate to the countdown that they're talking about? How does a policeman know that the building is about to blow up? So some people got the word, others didn't. Kevin McPadden heard the countdown. BBC announces it 20 minutes before it actually happened. They say the Solomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center 7 has also collapsed. Now, there it is standing right behind her shoulder while she's making this announcement. And they actually give the reason. They say, due to structural weakening by fire. So they have the reason, they announce it, they cite the mistakes, the confusion of the day, of course, but does this make them psychic? I don't think so. It's more apparent, perhaps, that a script was handed out to different news agencies. So what we have is a set of data which goes together to support the hypothesis of controlled demolition at World Trade Center 7. So let me ask you, who are the jury in this case, how many of you believe that an official story still that the fires brought this building down? Big show of hands. Where's my dozen? I had a dozen. Are you guys still here? One? Anybody? I just need one. That's all I need. Did I convince that? This is the first. Usually there's one or two. I'll take that. Thank you. Please bring me your question afterward, and we'll have a Q&A, and I want you to go first, if you wouldn't mind coming right up. And how many are unsure still? There's got to be some people that are unsure. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 in the back, 13, 14, 15. One down here. Okay, 15 unsure. So we went from 52 to 15 on the unsure. And how many believe this is controlled demolition? Okay, I get the picture. Well, let me just suggest something to you. Al-Qaeda could not have had access, I think, to a building that had the CIA, the IRS, Department of Defense, Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, which had relationships with all of these agencies, the Securities and Exchange Commission, one of the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon, to be sure. They could not have gotten in past security, I don't think, to set these explosives. So we're talking about something really dark all of a sudden. If Building 7 was a controlled demolition on 9/11, then no matter what evidence you have or don't have with anything else related to 9/11, you're looking at some sort of inside job. And that's why they call us conspiracy theorists, okay? That's as far as we go. It appears to be some sort of inside job. But we're not conspiracy theorists. We're architects and engineers. We're presenting the evidence. Your job is to take the next step and to find out, well, who would have done it? Why? How could this have been done? Well, how could they have pulled it off? All these questions, which we'll get to in a moment. But you're left with a dark internal exploration. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And it gets darker, unfortunately, because in the case of the Twin Towers, the evidence is even greater for the explosive controlled demolition hypothesis. Let's look at it. First, some people really liked the Twin Towers, calling them the crowning achievement of the international style. Others, heartless modernism. One famous architect calls it gigantic, what's the word? I forget what he called it, but it's basically two tall squares. I mean, how exciting can that be? Compare that to the elegance of the Empire State Building, which it eclipsed and was the highest couple of buildings in the world for a year until the Sears Tower. We have a 12.5-foot floor-to-floor height, which is relevant because of the way the beams, the columns were cut. Now, I'll get back to that, but we have for the first time in high-rise construction, a structural system which allows 60 feet of open office planning and 30 feet on the side, with this tube within a tube building structural configuration. It received awards right in 1971 by the American Society of Civil Engineers, citing the greatest engineering achievement of mankind, or something like that. Right away, though, they had difficulty renting it out. It was undesirable, actually, with these kind of gun-slit vertical windows, low ceilings, and until Rockefeller forced 20,000 of his state employees into the building and saved it from financial disaster, it would have gone under. And so, still, it almost did, because right away, it requires $200 million for asbestos removal, $800 million for rebuilding the electrical communication systems, and galvanic corrosion was endemic. The aluminum fascia panels were corroding at their connection points to the structural steel columns. So it needed all of this money. Now, it changes hands. The entire World Trade Center complex on 9/11, from public hands, the Port Authority, to private hands, Larry Silverstein, who invests $125 million of his own money and leverages it with his partners to purchase this complex for $3.2 billion and takes possession of the property less than 3 months prior to 9/11. He has to invest $5 to $15 billion just to rebuild all these systems. Did he know that he wasn't actually going to have to do that? That's the subject for another investigation. Now, most high-rises up to this time were built in this dense grid of steel or concrete frames all the way through the building at 20 or 30 feet on center of these columns, impeding the open office space. But the Twin Towers were built as this tube structure with a very strong, dense mesh of steel around the outside, a Varandeel truss with perpendicular and horizontal elements welded to each other and then bolted in the prefabricated units. Inside was the core, a dense grid of 47 immense box columns, 4-inch thick at the base, 2-inch thick at mid-height. And the prefabricated floor assemblies were then brought in and dropped. This is the core column, almost solid steel at the base. So the trusses spanned 60 feet and 35 feet. They were bolted to the perimeter structure with 2 5/8 bolts and to the inside as well. So we have a very strong structure. This is a 100,000-ton heat sink. Any 1,800-degree fire, as NIST somehow claims, but has no evidence, as we'll get to, that fire was that hot, 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, would have been immediately wicked away throughout the steel in this building. That's why no steel frame high-rise building has ever fallen, because of the dense properties of steel. Hold a spoon up to your stove. You drop the spoon almost instantly due to the conduction of heat. And so this is a structure within a structure. The core columns are 52 inches wide at the base and 16 inches high in the corners and on the ends, and the other core columns are 36 by 12. These are arranged tightly and interconnected with 30 and 36-inch deep girders. Any pancaking collapse out here in the perimeter would have left the core structure standing 1,368 feet high in the air, like records falling on a spindle. The old record players, for those of you who aren't currently in college, know about this. You can't get there with an iPod. The analogy fails miserably. Connecting these the core columns to the perimeter is this hat truss, which ties them together, because the perimeter columns are taking the loading from earthquakes and, more importantly out here, winds up to 140 miles an hour they were designed. In fact, they were over-designed for the first time in a high-rise by a factor of 20. I'm sure that had something to do with, as we'll see, the requirement that this building take a direct hit from an airplane. In fact, here we are.
John Skilling and Les Robertson were the structural engineers who designed the streamlined steel frames of the Twin Towers in the 1960s. Because a wayward Army bomber flew into the Empire State Building in 1945, the towers were built with skyscraper crashes in mind.
We had designed the project for the impact of our largest airplane at the time, the Boeing 707. That is to take this jet airplane, run it into the building, destroy all the structure, and still have it stand up.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners, because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
But Leslie Robertson's boss says that it was designed to take a 707 traveling 600 miles an hour, much faster than the plane that hit the Twin Towers. And our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that the fuel would dump into the building. They did account for the fuel, but the building structure would still be there. In fact, the official story applauds the structural engineering, saying that it performed remarkably. The plane hit, the building oscillated. It was about 56 minutes later and 102 minutes later that they blame the structural weakening by fire to ultimately succumb to the collapse. Right away, we have an effort to deceive us, the American people, NOVA, talking about how this building could so easily collapse because all it is, after all, is a stack of pancakes waiting to fall down. No core structure. The 9/11 Commission report calls the core a hollow steel shaft. It's misrepresented everywhere. Also misrepresented are these floors which don't have their cross trusses shown, or the composite steel and concrete deck on top, which assists in avoiding deflection. So there's an effort to show us, without a core, again, how the FEMA report works. Now, the FEMA report basically says that these trusses disengaged themselves. Those two 5/8 bolts basically broke. And then you have a floor pancaking down. Now, that didn't work because that would blame the building for the collapse instead of the terrorists. We need to blame the terrorists, so what we do is we blame the fire, which the terrorists caused, by not having the connections at the trusses fail, but they blame the persistence of it. I'll get to that in just one second. And FEMA also shows the core columns smaller and kind of randomly spaced, but in this other plan, which more adequately shows the orthogonal relationship of the columns and to scale, you can see, and we know that because the Silverstein-Weidlinger report, somebody leaked us a CD-ROM. You can download all the architectural drawings from our website, ae911truth.org, and you can see, for instance, on the 66th floor, how all the core columns, this is a blow-up of the core, are in fact shown to their proper scale and arrangement. These are the trusses. This is the connection of the truss to the interior core structure and the connection to the exterior core structure. And so what FEMA does is they blame that connection and because they pull in the columns and somehow they claim they snapped these columns, but steel does not act like this. Steel is a very ductile material at this scale, and it doesn't snap like this. But anyway, NIST claims that there is a 42-inch sag due to the fire, which then pulled in these columns. And we'll see how fast they think that happened, and tell me if it makes sense to you. Now, when we look at the evidence for controlled demolition with the Twin Towers, we're looking at some very key differences between them and Building 7. We have a sudden onset of destruction, but not at the base of the building, but up where the jet planes are. Why? Because if you want to blame the collapse of this building on the fire, that's where you're going to start the explosions. And we have a straight down symmetrical collapse, but not into its own footprint, but as we'll see, everything's exploding outside the footprint. In addition, we have very interesting evidence, pools of molten iron found at the bottom of all three buildings, iron microspheres in the dust everywhere, which we'll get to, and actually evidence of unexploded thermate, which is an incendiary, which we'll be talking about as well. Let's start with this sudden onset of destruction at the jet impact.
The words of a senior blaster.
We blow the basement, all the columns in the basement. Then we crack it up at the top to get it started. We go every other floor all the way down. Every explosive has a timeline. That's why it's controlled. When the columns go, each floor goes down and impacts the one below and keeps going.
Mark Loiseau is president of a company called Controlled Demolition.
You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure. You don't have to go to the top floor. You can go almost anywhere in the structure, and given the right circumstances, you can release all of that stored energy, convert it into what is called kinetic energy. That's energy in motion, and that's what brings the building down.
Now, there are precedents for a top-down controlled demolition. In this case, this building will start at the top and proceed downward. And in this case, you also see large flashes of light, the sounds of explosions, which actually, there they are. There's a delay between the camera and the explosions. That's a heck of a delay. And then this 20-story middle down explosion, very curiously similar to the Twin Towers. So you can do it from the top down. We're told, uh-oh, that doesn't look good at all. We're told by oh, good, I got past it. We're told by NIST that it couldn't have been a controlled demolition because it didn't start at the bottom. Well, in 2005, we have 1,000 oral recordings that were finally released by emergency workers because of a lawsuit by the New York Times against the city, in which the New York Court State of Appeals overrules the city and releases. And it turns out that 118 of these firefighters alone, not newscasters, which we also have plenty of, and I'm going to show you, but these guys who report sounds and sights of explosions. We felt the ground shake. You could see the tower sway and it just came down. All of a sudden the ground, well, why is the ground shaking? Due to a gravitational collapse 80 stories in the air. It shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking, heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center, there was this orange and red flash coming out. Initially, just one flash. Then this flash kept popping all the way around the building, and that the building had started to explode. We were there, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes. Seemed like on television they blow up these buildings. Seemed like it was going all the way around, like a belt, all these explosions. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash, came out of the building, and then it would just go all the way around the building on both sides. Saw flash, 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 and then it looked like the building came down. You hear this again, and then the building came down. Explosions, and then the building came down. A very important order, as you'll see. That's when I saw the building coming down. Let's talk about where these explosions might be coming from.
The buildings as they fall into their footprints, the tremendous billowing clouds of dust. Now let's look at the collapse of the Twin Towers. We are seeing explosions rather than implosions of first in demolition history. The sequence rumble becomes a roar as debris is thrown outward. The damage is not contained. Even the windows are blown through neighborhood buildings. What kind of energy enabled this? Would fire hurl metal and concrete sideways into the air? Here, a 600,000-pound chunk of steel, twice the weight of a Boeing airliner, was flung 400 feet, wedging itself deep into 3 World Financial Center on Vesey Street. A female photographer taking pictures of Ground Zero wondered why so many steel beams were jutting from neighborhood buildings. What shot pieces of the towers all the way across the street? In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
It surprised me that there were still bone fragments or human remains that had not been discovered.
How is it possible that after 5 years they're finally looking on the rooftop of the Deutsche building? I mean, that's crazy.
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
I think all of us have to come up with our own answer to that question. Across the street, on top of a high-rise building, 700 bone fragments, less than half an inch.
If there were a gravitational collapse, we would expect the 2,749 people to be trapped and in that downward gain, not blown into tiny bits and landing on the roofs of surrounding skyscrapers. Let's see how that might have been possible as we take a look at the North Tower's collapse in a little more detail here. What I want you to watch for is the telescoping of this 20-story piece of building down to 10 stories before it ever drops. In other words, half the mass of this pile driver is going to drop, is going to be destroyed before your eyes after a series of explosions evidenced by the smoke clouds on the top. There's one up at the top. On the left, you'll see another one right there, and then it goes down. Okay, so we've lost one story, or two, 3 or 4, 5 or 6, 7 or 8, and the really, from the jet plane impact, hasn't even started to go down yet. And then what you have is the building tearing itself apart at virtually free fall speed as we see. Let's take a look from this angle. The explosions have already started. They're, like the firemen were saying, like a belt all the way around evenly. The smoke is already coming out before the collapse. The gravitational potential hasn't even developed, and there's smoke coming out almost everywhere out of this top portion. Now, take a look at this compilation and tell me if this looks like a gravitational collapse to you. You'll see squibs underneath. I'll point them out to you. We'll see this a couple of times. And right here, 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 these explosions occur down below. We'll take another look at those squibs or mistimed, look at this, very violent, extremely violent hurling debris outward, the outward edge. Now we're going to go into a reverse so you can actually see it with more clarity here. And here's the reverse coming up now. A little easier to see. And on the South Tower, we have the same thing. That was the North Tower.
Building has just collapsed. As if a demolition piece set off when you see the old building.
You can see all of these independent explosions. In the case of the South Tower, it's less like a belt wrapping around, but it favors one side. And as a result, this top portion, we'll talk about in a moment. Do we have a straight down symmetrical collapse outside the footprint? Well, yes, 1,200 foot diameter FEMA documents around each of the twin towers. You can see the effect on Building 7. That's how it received some of the damage. 1,200 feet is the extent of the diameter, and this is the building width right here. So it's an incredibly explosive event. The entire World Trade Center site was filled with individually cut beams, and this is the nice tidy pile. Compared Building 7, a very different controlled demolition. This is where the North Tower stood. The South Tower, there is no pile at the base of the North or South Tower. We will come back to that point. There is about there's a pile. There's about a story or two of debris. That is it. Do we have squibs or evidence of explosives at the floors below the ensuing collapse?
In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here. Here.
That's easily 60 stories below the collapse.
Here.
Now, NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who did the report, the most recent report, tells us these are puffs of air produced by the pile driver, which is pushing down the building, and all that air, like a piston, comes out down the hoistway and comes into the room. Well, let's say the elevator shaft is behind me, and that air comes into this room. Remember, these are large open spaces. It's going to fill the room fairly uniformly full of air pressure, and then maybe bust out all the windows if it busts out any, right? But what we have is highly focalized ejections, that most of which occur at the midpoint between the corners of the building. And these are not puffs of air. These are pulverized building materials. And not only that, it's on video. We can tell what the speed is. The velocity is 160 to 200 feet per second of these ejections. And that's explosive speeds. So, and furthermore, does anybody see a pile driver up here? In all the videos, it's destroyed itself in the first 4 seconds. There's nothing left pushing down the building. This is important when we get to our next point, which is free fall pace.
Galileo's law of falling bodies calculates the time in which an object will travel a certain distance in complete free fall. Distance, d, equals 16.8 times time in seconds squared. The South Tower was 1,362 feet tall. 1362 equals 16.08 times 84.7, or 9.2 seconds. The Twin Towers came down at nearly free fall speed.
Let's talk about this just a minute between us, because it appears as if the laws of physics were suspended on 9/11. I just want to bring them back for a moment. Let's hold a 20-story building, 80 stories above nothing, with a crane, and another one over 80 stories of building structure below it, with 80,000 tons of structural steel designed to resist that load. Now we're going to drop each one simultaneously. How many say this one's going to hit the ground first with nothing underneath it? Okay, pretty much all. Does anybody suggest that they might fall at the same time? Is that oh, 1, 2. Thank you. I want to hear why you, at the end, I want to hear your questions. You guys have first dibs at the microphone. So what we're told is that all of a sudden, that 80,000 tons of structural engineering designed to resist that load for the life of the building is giving no resistance. Okay? None. Zilch. Absolutely none. This violates the laws of the conservation of momentum as well. So this is fairly straightforward physics. Most 6th graders get this. So I really want to get it also, why it might not be true, for those of you who can help me. The pile driver was creating that, right? We're told that massive weight is just crushing that building at free fall speed. I showed you there's no pile driver. Now, tell me how that building is crushing itself at free fall speed. Do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Yes. The columns are cut to 37.5-foot lengths. There's a column every 3 floors. There appears to be a concussive side blast at each of the splice welds of these columns, and they have fairly clean breaks in these welds. And one side of these columns, and sorry I don't have this picture to show you today, is concave. The other side is peeled away. Gordon Ross, you'll want to Google him. He talks about this in detail. Gordon Ross, R-O-S-S. Here is the South Tower getting ready to explode, and what happens? We have initial failure right here, and the building begins to fall away at 30 degrees. Now, we would expect that portion of that building to continue its angular momentum, fall to the street as a mass. How can it contribute then, therefore, to the crushing of this building beneath it? But let's see what it does now. It completely disappears, disintegrates in this rapidly expanding cloud. It does not fall to the ground in a mass. It's completely disappeared. And then after that, we saw the building tearing itself apart.
Here is the building from the side, 30 degrees. Now let's take a look from below. These occur a floor every 1/10 of a second. A 1/10 of a second per floor, or 10 floors, 11 floors actually, per second. That is faster than free fall up top in this case. And the corners are fairly well spared. So these is all the way around the building, like they said, like a belt. Does that look like a gravitational collapse? No, we have a complete dismemberment of all the structures. In fact, in this 7-story lobby, we see only a couple of stories of structural steel and aluminum cladding. Where are all the pancakes, the floor systems? Well, this gentleman brought 6,000 of them to the site during the late 60s, and he went to help the cleanup, Tom Patrizzo. And he writes, there's stuff crumpled up, but identify it as a floor deck if you can. I couldn't believe it. Not one floor panel. Where are they? We don't... Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about 20-gauge steel decking that is with 4-inch thick concrete and 5-inch thick reinforced concrete, an acre in size each floor, and 110 of them. 90,000 tons of concrete. We're going to be looking for them, for all that concrete, because it's not at the floor. We don't see macroscopic chunks of concrete. We don't see floors. All we see is structural steel and aluminum cladding. Do we have lateral ejection? Well, the videos show us that we have 45 miles an hour of lateral ejection of these 20-ton steel beams hurled out 500 feet around. Again, no pile driver on top. Do we have sounds and flashes produced by explosions? None of these explosions are a part of the official story.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under-infrastructure of the building you bring it down.
The entire building has just collapsed as if the demolition team set off when you see the old demolition, the old building. It's further down on itself and it is not there anymore. Completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed as if the demolition team set off when you see the old demolition, the old building. It's further down on itself and it is not there anymore.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the building, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more filth and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
That's true.
And all of a sudden, it was a great explosion. I don't know if just like what you just seen, that's what we went through before we came out of the building.
There was another big explosion. Many others are flames coming out of this building and throwing smoke. People still not panicking. People not understanding what's going on. Then somebody said that they saw an airliner going to one of those towers. Then, an hour later than that, we had a big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know on those floors there. Whatever the cause, the terribleness, the hugeness of what's happened. So idiosyncratic that most of the people around simply can't understand what's happening. People are standing around, talking to each other.
Watch his reaction now as the explosion occurs at the North Tower. He's putting his hand over his ears. He's hearing the explosions that the others were hearing at the top. Look how far away he is. Now, Barry Jennings is referring to World Trade Center 7 here and explosions that he witnessed at the base at World Trade Center 7, and well, actually at the 7th floor.
Big explosion. Moved back into the 8th floor. Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion. There was a huge explosion. Howard Perry told me that he was here after the events that took place this morning. He tried to get his map as quickly as he could, but he said that there was another explosion which took place. And then an hour after, there was another explosion in one of the towers here. So according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now ready to ground.
Another explosion live at the site, hearing it all the way down at the base of the building.
This one, but boom, it was like a domino. And it was like holy hell coming down the stairs. And then we finally got to the bottom, we were coming out, on the mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right on the everyone flying.
It sounded like gunfire. And then all of a sudden, three big explosions.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds, and turned around to see the building we just got out of, and kind of tip over and fall on itself.
We heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted. Whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
In fact, there were quite a few reports of explosions down at the base as well as up at the top at the onset of destruction.
And here on making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
We made outside, we made it about a block. We made it at least 2 blocks, and we saw it in block. It was 12 by 4, so all the way down. It was launching and running. It was ran up, and then you just saw this cloud of shit chasing me down. Couldn't run the first street. I couldn't outrun it. I jumped behind the giant car. I hit the car. It was swinging the car.
Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. Low-level flashes I saw. These are back to the court-ordered releases. The building is blowing up on all 4 sides. You heard the pops. You know, they heard the pops of the building. Thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere. That's how loud it was, a crackling explosive. This goes on and on and on. In fact, it's important to hear this particular video of Dr. David Ray Griffin, who authored The New Pearl Harbor, which puts together the context in an extraordinary way surrounding all of the events of 9/11.
It looked like sparkling around one specific layer of the building. My initial reaction was that this was exactly the way it looked when they show you those implosions on TV. A few witnesses spoke of horizontal ejections. Chief Frank Crothers said there was what appeared to be an explosion. It appeared at the very top, simultaneously from all 4 sides. Material shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before we could see the beginning of the collapse. Now that's very important because defenders of the official theory say that these horizontal ejections were caused when the floors collapsed and pushed the material out. So listen to firefighter James Curran, who said, I looked back and I heard like every floor went toop, toop, toop. I looked back and from the pressure, everything was getting blown out of the floors before it actually collapsed. Probably provided by Auxiliary Lieutenant Fireman Paul Isaac. Having said that there were definitely bombs in those buildings, Isaac added that many other firemen know there were bombs in the buildings, but they're afraid for the job to admit it because higher-ups forbid discussion of this side.
Well, that's too interesting. Now, how might somebody have gotten into the Twin Towers to set these explosives without being detected by the the occupants? We have the floor plan up here. We enlarge the core plan. Well, it turns out that most of the
elevator hoistways are adjacent to the columns, particularly in the lower floors. Well, they're surrounded by 2 layers of 3/4-inch gypsum board, which you can hack through with an axe, and get access to the core columns, which have 3-hour fire protection with more gypsum board, which you can hack through with an axe. Indeed, there was a lot of witnesses describing a nuisance of white powder throughout the building, too. But you'd need to have access, wouldn't you? Well, it turns out that there was an elevator modernization going on, which is well documented, the 9 months prior to 9/11. And this could get access through security with in all of the elevators, and you could access all those core columns. So I think there's enough energy in the explosions in the core section so that they didn't have to set charges in the perimeter structure. Well, let's talk about security for a second. The security was changed out 6 weeks prior to 9/11 to a company called Securicom. Their contract ended on either the 10th or the 11th. I mean, that's the way it was written, only for 6 weeks. Who's on the board of directors of Securicom? Marvin Bush, Wirt Walker III, a Bush cousin. These individuals need to be asked some very tough questions. Wireless detonation, of course, is common in the industry now, and so we don't have to run miles of wire. Do we have enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete? Well, let's take a look. At the base of the structure, the concrete is missing. Let's find out what might have happened.
One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we were told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like, there were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area that crossed the river that made it almost all the way to New Jersey from the pictures that I've seen. This type of flow is something that we are familiar with in physics. It occurs in only 2 situations that we know of naturally. One is in volcanic eruptions where a large amount of material is suddenly exploded into the air and basically forms small particles. The other situation is something called turbidity currents. These occur along the edges of continental shelves where mud or sediment will slump, become suspended in water. And the common thread is that you have large amounts of a dense material that is suspended very quickly in the fluid, thereby creating another denser fluid, which is in effect the dust cloud. And that fluid can achieve considerable velocities. The problem with creating this sort of slurry of fine particles is that there really is no mechanism that has been proposed. We have concrete floors with carpeting or flooring over them. We have furniture. We have floors basically that are coming together in a collapse, but the concrete is basically protected under these layers. Early in the collapse, in the very first moments, we see these thick clouds being ejected at very high speed. They're clearly dense because they flow downward and become part of this large overall pyroclastic flow. What we're basically being told is that the concrete sort of jumped up into midair, exploded itself, and then was ejected as the floors came together. Not a very plausible mechanism, but I have yet to hear of anything else proposed to explain it. From quite a few people on the scene, we've been told that the powder represented most of the concrete, that the amount of intact macroscopic chunks of concrete on the scene were negligible, that basically everything was reduced to powder. And incidentally, we also know that other things besides concrete were reduced to powder. We know the contents of computers, exotic metals from computer chips, these sorts of things were also identified in the dust and in very small particles, generally on the order of less than 100 microns in diameter. So we have a real issue of mechanism as far as what in the process of this collapse could cause so many things to be pulverized so finely.
Yeah, that's the width of a human hair. Let's listen to Governor Bataki.
And you see, there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum steel. What happened to the concrete was pulverized.
When I was down here Tuesday, it was like you're on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just the site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
You have 210-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of the telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
And all over Manhattan. Actually, now you can calculate the expansion of these dust clouds, which require, well, there's gravitational potential available, right, in that 20-story building, which we already know doesn't even exist after 4 seconds. But let's say it did. It's about 110,000 kilowatt hours. Well, the required energy to expand those dust clouds to how many times the easily greater than the volume of the building in 30 seconds. It requires over 10 times that gravitational potential. Not only that, as the molten metal, which I'll be showing you, has to be created, that takes well over the amount of gravitational potential, 10 times. Also, not only that, crushing the structural steel, 80,000 tons at free fall speed, takes an amount of energy, which is also well over at least 10 times the gravitational potential. And not only that, the pulverization of the concrete itself into dust takes easily well over the gravitational potential. All 4 of those energy sinks by themselves require a massive amount of energy which was not available. This is the only file cabinet found. It was in the basement. There were hundreds of thousands of file cabinets in the Twin Towers. All of them, apparently, were pulverized and couldn't find small enough pieces. This one you could pick up with your pinky. The victims, unfortunately, were pulverized as well. Of 2,749 of them, only 300 whole bodies were found. 800 could be identified by DNA. And 1,100 are completely missing. I mean, we're talking vaporized, nothing to get a DNA sample of, because even though there were 20,000 pieces of bodies found, 6,000 small enough to fit into test tubes, and 200 of these pieces matched to one person. This begins to match up with the small bone fragments found on the skyscraper, 700 of them. What could cause such a massive degree of pulverization? Well, let's take a look at the beginning of that story, molten metal, because it's extremely important, because as you'll see, the official story denies that any of the molten metal that you're going to see evidence for exists, including Leslie Robertson, structural engineer, who noted, of the World Trade Center, noted as of 21 days after the attack, fires were still burning, molten steel was still running. Chief O'Toole remembers seeing a crane lifting a steel beam vertically from deep within the catacombs at Ground Zero. It was dripping from molten steel. And these fires were not extinguished until 3 months after 9/11. They persisted and persisted.
Mark Loiseau, the president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, told the American Free Press that in the basement of the World Trade Center, there are 47 central support columns connected to the bedrock. Hotspots of literally molten steel were discovered more than a month after September 11th. These incredibly hot areas were found at the bottoms of the elevator shafts, down 7 basement levels. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed. He said that molten steel was also found at World Trade Center 7. The highest temperature was in the east corner of the South Tower, where a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded. The molten steel in the basement was more than double that temperature.
Let's see what we're talking about here. A and B in the upper right corner are the hot spots of Building 7 at 1,340 degrees. World Trade Center 1 and 2 are down here. We're going to talk about why the molten steel, or molten iron, as it turns out to be, is so very important.
But these are surface temperatures. The real source of these temperatures is 5-6 stories down in the basement, the molten iron. In fact, here's a backhoe picking up this molten iron. We know by the colors that it's 15 to 1800 degrees at least. Well, office fires are only 12 to 1400 degrees. So we're talking about temperatures that were created by something other than an office fire. As you can see here, structural steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2700 degrees. So we're going to cast our eye at the hypothesis of thermate, an aluminothermic reaction. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. But let me just point out, we have dripping molten iron off of this chunk. Now, how does it get to be dripping if its temperature is only 15 to 1800 degrees and steel doesn't melt till 2700? Well, we're going to find out that the addition of sulfur lowers the melting point of this steel. Sulfur is a key ingredient in thermate, so that's an answer for us there. But let's take a look at what happened to these beams.
The steel in dragon-like lengths and contortions spoke for itself. Bent, deformed, without cracks.
I find it hard to believe that it's actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It's bent without a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically, you got buckling and tearing on the tension side, but there's no buckling at all. There's no buckling at all.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in their lives.
Explosives also deform steel. As they fire, gas pushes outward. The force of the gas can easily bend a large steel column.
Fires burned and molten metal flowed, and the pile of ruins still settling beneath my feet. So right on the street, this molten metal is also being pursued. Our architect Bart Vorsanger was hired to find relics in the rubble.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel, and concrete, and all these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
And almost like a chunk of lava from Kilauea or Iceland, with a very sharp but breakable shards on the end here.
How about the firefighters? What did they see?
Get down below and see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channels. Like you're in a foundry.
Okay, here's John Gross, lead engineer of NIST, denying all of this evidence and the increasing evidence which you'll see following him. Why does he have to deny?
Well, I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that's found in the bottom of the tower.
Tell me about it. Did you ever see it?
Well, not personally, but the witnesses there found huge pools
Does he sound a little defensive?
of molten steel beneath the towers. And some scientists think that the collapse of the building could have mounted all that steel. And this professor analyzed some of the steel, and Stephen Jones, he found evidence of thermate residue, which would explain how the buildings collapsed. I mean, 3 times explosion. So, have you analyzed the steel for thermate residue?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so that would produce it.
You get down below and you see molten steel. Molten steel running down the channels. Like you're in a foundry. By lava.
is one of the biggest things. Out cell rubble, it's still with 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
This is how expensive they were illegal. This is simply flavor, almost simply flavor. And as you get closer to the center, as it gets hotter and hotter, it's probably 1,500 degrees. We got some small windows into what we thought was a door at some point, and it looked like an oven, just warm inside. This is a bright, reddish orange color.
I know absolutely nobody has no eyewitnesses that said they would produce.
Okay, well, how about these? Are these credible witnesses, people who were cleaning up Ground Zero? Peter Tolley, literally molten steel. I saw melting girders at the World Trade Center, says structural engineer Abu Hassan Astani. Saw molten steel trapped beams just totally been melted because of the heat. Steel flowed in molten streams. Molten was found 3, 4, or 5 weeks later. Molten steel found at 7. Molten steel flowed in the pile of ruins. We saw that one. Allison Gale. In some pockets now being uncovered, they're finding molten steel. Molten steel, red-hot molten beams, red-hot weeks into the event. Still molten steel at the heart of the towers remains. Molten steel, major role in the debris. Everything from molten steel to human remains. The streams of molten metal that leaked away. Molten metal dripping from the beam. Dripping from molten steel. Dripping on both sides of the wall from Building 6. Red-hot molten running. Collapse, molten, far beyond a normal fire that it's nearly impossible to draw conclusions about it based on other fires. Cherry red. So let's talk about what produced this molten steel and why it might be important. Let's start with thermate as a hypothesis.
Used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, let's see if there isn't evidence for this thermate in the chemical analysis that have been performed on several of the artifacts found in this one. A 40-pound chunk of previously molten iron was sent to Dr. Jones, formerly of Brigham Young University, physics professor. He and other physicists analyze it, and if there were thermate, what we would have is aluminum, sulfur, and iron oxide, and other unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. So he analyzes it, and he finds that it's predominantly iron. So we're not talking about melted jet planes, which are aluminum. It has very little chromium, so we're not talking about melted structural steel. And it has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium, key ingredients in thermate. It has manganese and fluorine in abundance. What is fluorine? Fluorine's the oxidizer used in thermate charges. And he took another sampling for a small piece of slag from this monument at Clarkston University. It was sent to him, and he does X-ray fluorescence. He finds also sulfur, iron, potassium, manganese, the key chemical ingredients of thermate. Now, if gel explosives were used, it would leave a telltale residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. Now, gel explosives would be packed into a linear-shaped charge like this, where the thermate would be ejected forcefully through the structural steel beam at any point you wanted. And it would leave a similar trace or cut like this. It's not a real clean operation like an oxyacetylene torch from this piece of steel from the 9/11 Memorial Park from World Trade Center 7. or this piece of steel, which has traces of aluminum on it, the residue of thermate. But sol gels would leave a telltale residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. And in fact, EPA finds in a molecule that at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've done. Well, what did the EPA do with this information? You haven't seen it on the media. This is very, very important documentation. And they help us out further with the iron microspheres. Very interesting. What Dr. Jones finds in all of the dust like this from the World Trade Center, and he takes a magnet and he puts the magnet over the dust, and he finds that there's all of these metallic particles. So he puts them in the microscope, and he finds that, in fact, most of them are naked to the human eye, but they're perfectly round, and they're predominantly iron, and they have all of the trace chemical signature of thermate, once again, the aluminum, the sulfur, the iron. Well, what in God's name, how did they get there, and how were they round? This is really quite a mystery. Well, it turns out that if you have thousands of cutter charges placed throughout the beams and the columns in the buildings, and you set them off under this high pressure, what you're going to have is the byproduct of an aluminothermic reaction, which is molten iron, as dispersed, like this water from a spray bottle. What is the shape of the droplets coming out of here? They're round, they're spheres, because their surface tension forms it into spheres. It's just what happens. So that's how they're formed, apparently. In fact, they used to make bullets pre-revolutionary times by dropping molten lead in little drops off the top, and by the time they got to the bottom, they were perfectly sphered, and they would drop into a water to complete the cooling. And that's how that may be how we won the revolution. I'm not quite sure, but it's interesting. So we have these spikes of iron in the electrospectroscopy graph here, and aluminum and sulfur here. This is sulfur, yeah, and other small, like manganese. These are, and it matches a classic controlled experiment with thermate. So we're talking about these iron little spheres, indeed, have all the same chemical signature, thermate. Who else finds the spheres in the World Trade Center dust? The EPA. They really come through for us here. They don't know where they came from. They can't explain them. It's a mystery. They drop it like a hot potato. But it could explain the toasting of the top of these cars, because they might still be hot. Even if they're not hot, they have these toxic chemicals. So somebody could do some research as to, there's no other rational explanation for the top of these cars being so severely corroded. And manganese, one of the other byproducts of thermate, the city's chief medical examiner finds on top of the Deutsche Bank building in his toxicological study for the Deutsche Bank building. So Dr. Jones concludes that significant aluminothermic reactions occur here with powders of aluminum, iron oxide, copper oxide, zinc nitrate, sulfur, and potassium permanganate, which is the manganese. So, not only that, later, he just released, Dr. Jones, in December, his latest work. He finds these tiny little chips in the dust of these unexploded thermite pieces, up to a 1/16 of an inch high. They also come up to the magnet, and they have a very interesting composition. Red on one side, which turns out to be iron oxide. Gray on the other side. This side here is the gray side. This is a cross-section through it. This is the iron oxide. This is the aluminum. Fine, fine, fine particles. Very high-tech stuff. It can only be manufactured by not you and me, and not Al-Qaeda. Let's put it that way. And this is the elevation, the surface of it beyond over here. So it also has the key ingredients of unexploded thermate: iron, manganese, aluminum,
and on and on. So we have very clear forensic, science-based evidence that could put a group of traitors, whoever they are, in jail or hanged or whatever they do to traitors these days for a long, long time. Well, in jail for a long, long time, I won't go into the rest. The results, coupled with the visual evidence at the scene, such as flowing yellow, hot liquid metal, provide compelling evidence that thermate reaction compounds were used, meaning thermate was deliberately placed in both World Trade Center towers and Building 7. We have just compiled a list of evidence, forensic science-based evidence, which forms together toward our proof of controlled demolition, and it's supported by these other so let's just summarize it. Dr. David Ray Griffin does such a great job.
These facts taken together render the likelihood of the official theory essentially zero. In fact, each of the 10 phenomena, the likelihood of it occurring without explosives being used is by itself essentially zero. But let's be generous and suggest maybe there's a 1% chance that these things could occur. Virtual free fall speed, straight down, enormous amount of dust. 1% chance. But when you figure out the probabilities then, when you say how many, 2 of them would occur, 3 of them would occur, by the time you get up to 10 of them occurring without explosion, you're talking about the likelihood of 1 in a trillion. So, we can say that the official theory about the towers is disproved as thoroughly as any such theory could possibly be. Whereas all the evidence can be explained by the alternative theory, according to which the towers were brought down by explosives. The official theory is therefore an outrageous theory, whereas the alternative theory is, from a scientific point of view, the only possible theory.
Doesn't claim that. They just claim that it weakened it. So they suggest that office fires are normally in 930 to 1200 degree range. So steel can lose half of its strength at about 1200 degrees. So NIST needs to up the temperature of the fire to 1800 degrees. But in such fires, such as in the United Kingdom, there's been some really good tests where they actually burned a steel frame building up. It didn't collapse, but it did show that the steel temperature, even in a fire that hot, only got to be about 680 degrees, or half the amount of fire that could cause its weakening. And this was without fireproofing. Anyway, NIST claims 1800 degrees, and so even though they have in their metallographic analysis, they have no evidence to suggest that these temperatures ever got to 1800 degrees. In fact, 425 degrees Fahrenheit is what the paint deformation analysis shows. So in addition, we have Chief Oriel Palmer working his way up to the 78th floor, up all those stairs. And he says we have 2 isolated pockets of fire, should be able to knock it down with 2 fire lines. So that's not. Where's the raging inferno that we're all told? Right before the collapse. This is 10 minutes before the collapse. He lost his life after making this report. Coming down from the top before him was Brian Clark, a survivor, who says there were small flames lapping up against the wall. So the fire was virtually out, and presumably that's why they had to push the button. You can't have a building collapse due to fire if there's no fire in it. And that's why it collapses only after 56 minutes versus the North Tower, which went 102 minutes, I think. So they blame the dislodging of the fireproofing and weakening of the steel. We'll talk about that. The other supporting evidence is from FEMA itself. They say they document the evidence of thermate, actually, as it turns out. Oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting.
this is FEMA documenting this stuff for us. A liquid eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. And then they document it very carefully. A 1-inch column been reduced to 1/2-inch thickness. Its edges curled like a paper scroll, having been thinned to almost razor sharpness. Gaping holes, some larger than a silver dollar, like this piece of steel from World Trade Center 7. Again, melted steel. Per NFPA 921, if you see anything like this, you're supposed to conduct a criminal investigation for arson, looking for evidence of accelerants, which thermate could be considered an accelerant. Fire Engineering Magazine calls this investigation a half-baked farce. These are the fire protection engineers throughout America who use this magazine. They say respected members of the fire protection engineering community are beginning to raise red flags. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. Well, surely that NIST report, which got 3 years and $20 million, brought this whole thing to rest in all of our minds so we could go on with our lives and forget 9/11. Well, their objectives were to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed and how World Trade Center 7 collapsed. They're still juggling with 7. We may hear about it in July of this year. But what do they say? Look at this. The focus of the investigation on World Trade Center 1 and 2 was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, the sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions of collapse initiation were met and collapse became, they claim, inevitable. What are we talking about here? The plane hits the building and there's a fire, and they spend 10,000 pages describing those two events, and then there's some sagging, and then just where the first truss begins to pull in the first column, they stop their entire investigation. Well, after that is where, wait a minute, hold on. What's the title of this report? Final Report on the Collapse of the World Trade Center Twin Towers. So this is basically a Potemkin village designed to explain the collapse of the Twin Towers, but it stops before the whole collapse even begins. And that is a crime in and of itself. They attempt to hide this, prompting Jim Hoffman to write his Building a Better Mirage, NIST's 3-year, $20 million cover-up of the crime of the century. And in it he provides all of their unfounded assumptions, and such as how the South Tower fell first somehow, because they claim that there's more core damage in the South Tower, even though it hit the glancing diagonal blow, than the North Tower, which took dead on, because they had to explain why it fell after only 56 minutes. It's a mountain of distraction, startling omissions, outrageous lies, and fudged computer simulations, such as taking a realistic set of variables, I think that's cases A and B, and they didn't cause the computer simulation to collapse. So they crank up all the results, such as the airplane speed, its trajectory, the strength of the building, they lower, the amount of jet fuel. They crank all, and they're open about this, all of these variables until they get their computer model to collapse. They start with the conclusion, and they crank up the data until it reaches the results. This is not science. Structural engineers are railing against them for their refusal to show these visualizations in the data. You can't download it. It's a public investigation with the most secret, it's a public building. It should have been a publicly available investigation with the most secretly conducted investigation in history, I think. Former chief of NIST's Fire Science Division, Dr. Quintier, says, let's look at real alternatives that might have been the cause of the collapse of the World Trade Center towers. This is their own Fire Science Division chief. Oh, this is where they answer some questions. Did you look at controlled demolition? Did you find any evidence? No. Did you look? No. Curious. The destruction of evidence proceeded at 800 truckloads per day, and the Fire Engineering Magazine, again, crucial evidence that could answer many questions on the slow vote to China, showing astounding ignorance of the government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop. They were ignored.
Let's look at that testimony once again of the 118 firefighters which supports this investigation. We have whistleblowers in the underwriter laboratories of Kevin Ryan, who assisted NIST, who blew the whistle on UL and NIST because NIST hires UL to build sample sets of trusses and floor assemblies spanning 35 feet with 4 different sets with varying degree of fireproofing, and they put 2,000 degrees underneath. They put twice the known amount of loading that was in the World Trade Center on top, and it only sags 3 or 4 inches. It didn't fail. It passed the test. What does NIST do? They throw out the data, they throw out the experiments, and they say, well, we're going to use a 42-inch sag. That's not science. In fact, it's criminal because they're using your money to do it. Do we have expert corroboration?
The managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looks like, and that's what happened.
It was live on television. I mean, just literally millions of people.
We have Van Romero. It's too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structure. This is an explosives expert. Explosive devices caused the collapse of both towers, he thinks. My opinion is there were explosive devices inside the buildings that caused the towers to collapse. We have Mike Taylor. It looked like a classic controlled demolition. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers mirrored a strategy by demolition experts. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a free fall speed, as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. This is a structural engineer who, in fact, is William Rice here? He's one of our members, and he lives here on the East Coast. Let's go faster. It appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Well, do we have foreknowledge? Well, here's Rudy Giuliani.
I went down to the scene and we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which is right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management. And we were operating hours there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building, so we were trapped in the building.
Wait, he was told the World Trade Center was going to collapse? 10 minutes prior to the collapse? Did he tell the firefighters? No, he did not. Did he need a few heroes to make this whole story kind of work? Well, I believe we've shown lots of supporting data to support the hypothesis of controlled demolition. And I'd just like to check in with you. Is there anybody who believes that the World Trade Center Twin Towers was brought down by fire, jet fuel, and so forth, without controlled demolition? One. Thank you so much. I want you guys to be honest. This is really important. Just one. Because we had 12 before. Is anybody not sure at this point? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think there was a 7th one. 7, George. And I won't assume anything. How many of you believe they were brought down by controlled demolition? Okay, so I've shown a good number of you that we've supported this. Now, here's our problem. And I mean every one of our problems that just raised your hands. This messes with our worldview, right? Because Al-Qaeda didn't have access to the Twin Towers either. We are left wondering about the implications of this, and it's far more staggering, the implications, than is the evidence for controlled demolition. I just did my job. You've got a hell of a job to do now, because what's going to happen is our own psychology is going to... We're not wired to believe that elements, and we'll just make an assumption here, elements within our own government, since Al-Qaeda didn't have access to these buildings, could have been involved. So we're going to turn off. We're going to go into non-action. And we're going to come up with these kinds of excuses. Watch. In fact, our government wouldn't do this to us. Well, I'm not saying it's our government, okay?
Obviously, some elements maybe. I would have heard about it by now. Well, you are hearing about it now. There's a lot of things we don't hear about. Too many people would have been involved. The secret couldn't have been kept this long. Okay? Those are relevant arguments, okay? But they do not refute the evidence that you just saw. So the fact, whether or not you would have heard about it by now, it couldn't have been kept a secret, or I'm not an it's too horrible, I don't even want to think about it. That's what some of us will do. I didn't even see this stuff tonight. We go right into straight out denial, right? This helps us to avoid the debate, go back to sleep, become part of the problem. You can't do that. I will not let you do that. My job is to get you from this point launched, and I don't know what direction you're going to go. Each of us has our own response to this information, but a response is required of each and every one of you as a citizen of the United States and as a breathing, thinking, feeling American who just saw 2,794, whatever the number is, of our own citizens murdered before our eyes and blamed on a third world country which we invaded and still haven't even caught the perpetrator, right? Anyway, based on this rational scientific evidence, which I've presented to all but one or two of you and 6 unsured, work through our fears, our disbeliefs, our mindsets. Get informed. There's a lot of great information that we need to avail ourselves of. I will show that to you. And inform other AEs. We need to send the AE911truth.org link to every architect and engineer you know. It's extremely important that we reach 1,000 architects and engineers by 9/11. It's also extremely important that everybody in this room who supports who believes that this might have been a controlled demolition, sign on to our website. You don't even have to be an architect engineer. We have different categories for your membership. We need your support on the website. And support a new investigation, writing your congressman, calling into talk show hosts, writing academicians, as I mentioned, spreading our website all around. Because, let's face it, the buildings are a small part of this pie. This pie is huge, way huger than I can get into. Whether you talk about the flights where the hijack codes were, for the first time in a hijacking, they weren't transmitted at all by the pilots. NORAD standing down for an hour and a half while these flights were wandering around our skies. Hijackers, which appear to be alive, some of them, interviewed by the BBC, London Guardian, and others, showing up at our embassy saying, hey, that's my name, my birth date, but I'm not a hijacker. FBI obstruction of justice with their own whistleblowers like Sibel Edmonds. Stock market put options, where millions were made on these faded airliners. And where did that investigation end? At the owner of the Deutsche Bank building, a former CIA official. So the investigators say, well, Al-Qaeda wasn't involved in the stock market put options, so there's really no problem. Terrorist funding tied to the Pakistani government. The 9/11 Commission report having amazing quantities of conflicts of interest, such as being involved heavily financially in the defense industry or the oil industry or the banking industry, all of which profited enormously from 9/11. Afghanistan, once again a profit center for heroin production, and our oil pipelines are now being constructed from the Caspian Sea across Afghanistan, which the Taliban was avoiding. Is that the reason we went into Afghanistan? Obviously it wasn't for Osama. And by the way, there appears to be 2 Osamas. One's fat, one's skinny. The fat one takes credit for the attacks on America. The skinny one, who looks very different than the fat one, says, we didn't do this. If you want to know who's responsible for these attacks, look at the shadow government in your own government who wants to make this century a century of war, conflict between Christianity and Islam. 2 very different responses. Google Fatty Osama, 9/11, and you will learn some very interesting things about that tape that the Defense Department told us was from Osama. Now, he's no friend of mine, but I think we need to look at all sides of this. Why didn't we learn about this from our media? Well, maybe it has something to do with this quote from William Colby. The Central Intelligence Agency owns everyone of any significance in the major media. That's a hell of a statement from a CIA official, and he died shortly after that in a mysterious boating accident. But you can Google Operation Mockingbird, which will show you that they did, in the late 40s, begin putting reporters on the CIA payroll. And it's a very well-documented effort, and especially Project Censored, which tells us about this, as well as the 25 most censored stories in America today. So why did we not see the truth about 9/11? Well, it appears as if our government lied to us about the collapses. The 9/11 Commission reinforced this lie. FEMA and NIST justified it. The corporate media repeated and hammered in the lie. We really didn't stand much of a chance. I've proven to you, I believe, that explosives were used to destroy each of these 3 World Trade Center high-rises on 9/11. Now, it takes months of planning to place these explosives, of course, and so we're not talking about Al-Qaeda anymore. We're talking about, let's call it what it is. It's a conspiracy, just like the official conspiracy theory involving 19 fundamentalist hijackers. We're looking at now a different type of conspiracy. The evidence you've seen is just a small fraction of that conspiracy and the vast body of information that the 9/11 Truth Movement has put together. The questions raised are numerous and ominous that must be answered in a new investigation. So I encourage all of you to discover the evidence that I have not had time to bring to you tonight. And there are some great books and DVDs, and I'll show you here. In fact, you can see this whole presentation on DVD. It's for sale in the back for like 15 bucks. And everybody, go online, sign our petition, because with freedom comes responsibility. And in this country, we've abdicated our responsibility, and as a result, our freedom is being abdicated in the rolling out of the Patriot Act, which was written well before 9/11, the Military Commissions Act, the current H.R. 1955 Thought Crimes Act, which can make you a terrorist by you using force, and force is not defined anywhere. And one other thing, when you get to be 53, some of these things they don't stack up anymore. The horrible, does it get worse? The horrible acts of 9/11 and the events leading up to them deserve our thorough and unimpeachable investigation. So please sign on to AE 9/11 Truth and follow up. Get the DVD. Loan it to everyone. Don't let it sit on your coffee table. We need 1,000 architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. We also need your support financially. We have a staff of 6, and many of them are volunteers, and we're not able to pay them. So if you can become a sustaining member to AE 9/11 Truth as well with your monthly pledge, and that is very gratefully accepted, and we will only put that money toward the accomplishment of our mission. There's some great videos that we have heard. 9/11 Mysteries is one of them. Go online and buy it. David Ray Griffin, The New Pearl Harbor. Loose Change, Final Cut is now out. Scholars for 9/11 Truth and Justice is out. And also, I want you to hear, after I'm through here in about 5 seconds, from the student scholars for 9/11 Truth. And they're in every campus, or many, many, many campuses. And they started right here at Keene College. And I want to introduce you to this pair of wonders that we have right here. Great source of truth and inspiration. So is our website, AE 9/11 Truth. A time comes when your silence is betrayal, so please speak out. Thank you so very much. Now, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll have our questions and answers, and we'll try to answer all of your questions. With the gentlemen who have the doubts about the fires, I'd like you to come down and ask the first series of questions. Any of you who raise your hands who are unsure, and I want to right now.
Can you tell the students to stay for a second?
The students in particular, we want you to hear from Justin and and Mike about student scholars for 9/11 Truth.
Just make one brief announcement before they speak, before everyone leaves. I have two petitions. One is to New Hampshire Public Radio. The other one is to Paul Motes and the two senators. I wish you would sign those. It's a small start. And the other thing, there's a kitty there. This is called free, and of course it is free to you. But you can also understand that the cost our groups quite a bit of money to get Architect Gage here. We are very grateful he made it this time. We are grateful you came. But remember, things need to be done. Thank you, Architect Gage.
I like that, Architect Gage. Got a nice ring to it. Thank you. Justin Martell.
Okay, we have any students up here, or did the guys all take off? I know it's
Raise your hand if you're a student. We got students.
Okay, okay, good. I know it's a Saturday night. I've got plans after this as well. So basically, I'm Justin Martell. I'm a student at Franklin Pierce University, which is nearby. And last year, Mike Jackson and I co-founded a group called Student Scholars for 9/11 Truth in conjunction with Scholars for 9/11 Truth. And essentially, at this point, we've grown to over 80 members across the United States, Canada, the UK, and Japan. All students working independently to, investigate these events, the events surrounding September the 11th, and the aftermath, of course. You can check out our website, ssc911.org, and shoot me an email. All you got to do is, you don't have to send me an in-depth resume. Just sign up, say, hey, here I am. I know this is where I go to school. I go to Keene State. I'm majoring in political science, and I want to be a member. And from there, we can make videos, go on the radio. Whatever you want to do is fine. And there's no pressure to create a certain amount of material or anything like that. And now I want to introduce the co-founder of Student Scholars, Mike Jackson, who is a student here at Keene State.
Before I say anything, and I forgot to do this the last event we had, which was Loose Change Final Cut of Pavilion Theater. I want to really thank the Monadnock 9/11 Truth Alliance. They're the guys who got this Richard Gage event together. I've been researching 9/11 since 2004. I've been a student at Keene State since 2005, and I was a lone wolf for a while. So 2008, seeing all this is very encouraging for me. I'm a junior here at Keene State College, majoring in political science, and I'm glad some students came out tonight. In my opinion, I don't think there were enough, but for the crappy weather we did have, this is an excellent turnout. So I just also want to mention just a couple things really quick. Richard's presentation was obviously very knockout, and as you mentioned, there's a ton of issues within 9/11 that need to be explored and investigated. And I also want to stress that we have overwhelming support from many of the family members who lost loved ones on 9/11. The Jersey Girls are still fighting. Unfortunately, they were used by the media and even the Democratic Party to an extent during the last election, but they've grown from that, and they've done so much footwork from day one to investigate 9/11, and they support Richard Gage's work and student scholars and the Truth Movement. So there's a number of family members who are up on these issues and are fighting, even though the mainstream media wouldn't have you believe that. So there's real issues that need to be investigated. And if any students here raise your hands, if you're interested in joining, talk to Justin and I. I'm a student here. You can get in touch with me. And that's about it. So thank you very much, guys.
After the Q&A, and you want to exchange contact information there. And also, it would be appreciated if people can make donations to the Monadnock 9/11 Truth Alliance, who work very hard, and also for Mr. Richard Gage. And also, I've been asked to tell you that it's pretty much stopped snowing outside. So
Yay!